June 24, 1944, Iwo Jima Airfield, Barnon Islands. The volcanic ash runway shimmered in the morning heat. Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi 650, hands steady from years of sending enemy planes tumbling down in flames, more than most pilots ever even saw in the sky. He peered through the canopy, watching the eastern horizon, waiting for the American carrier planes. They wouldn't show up in tidy squadrons like in 41 now. They came in waves, so many that the sky turned dark, like a storm was rolling in. We shot them down every week, but they always came in dozens, always another dozen behind the last. Sakai said those words to a fellow pilot just before takeoff. They'd stick in the air long after, like the epitaph of Japanese naval aviation. With 28 kills, Sakai ranked among Japan's top aces. He understood what the younger pilots around him didn't want to see. The truth was right in front of them. Defeat wasn't just a matter of tactics or courage. It was simple math. No amount of heroism could change what was happening. Production numbers had already decided their fate. Just 600 meters away, Task Force 58 was launching its morning strike. 15 fleet carriers flung 450 planes into the sky, wave after wave, moving like clockwork. The Americans lost 89 planes the week before. Now they launched 5 times that number without a second thought. In the ready rooms of the USS Essex, Yorktown, and Lexington, young ensigns with 400 hours of flight training prepared for their first taste of combat. Behind them, factories kept churning out 3 new Hellcats for everyone that didn't make it back. The numbers told the story. America would build 96,318 aircraft in 1944 alone, more than Japan managed in the whole war so far. The outcome was already written. But Sakai's road to this impossible moment started years earlier. Back in the sticky summer of 1928, he was just a teenager then, standing at the gates of the Cabo Naval Base, eyes on a different future. Born in Saga Prefecture in 1916, the third of 8 kids in a poor farming family with an old samurai name, Sakai joined the Imperial Japanese Navy at 16. He wanted out of the rice fields, away from debt and dead ends. Getting into naval aviation was brutal by design. Out of the 1,500 hopefuls at the Tsuchiura Naval Aviation School in 1937, only 70 would earn their wings. They broke bodies and spirits on purpose, hang from iron bars until your hands bleed, swim in the freezing sea until you can't move, fly dizzying aerobatics until you puke, then climb back in and do it again. Sakai finished 11th in his class on November 27th, 1937, logging 650 flight hours, numbers that would seem insane to American trainers just a few years later. He got his first taste of combat over China in 38 and 39 with the 12th Kokutai Air Group, flying the Mitsubishi A5M against Chinese biplanes that belonged to another era. His first kill came on October 5th, 1938, near Hankow. A Soviet-built Polikarpov AFM-16 torched after a 2-second burst from his 7.7mm guns. By May 1941, Sakai joined the elite Tainan Kokutai on Formosa with 800 flight hours and 4 victories under his belt. The Tainan group was the best Japan had. Pilots who'd become legends. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would rack up 87 kills before he died. Toshio Ota with 34, Masaki Shimakawa with 27. They saw themselves as modern samurai. Skill and spirit, they believed, could beat any odds. The first real shock came December 8th, 1941, December 7th across the date line, when Sakai flew in the attack on Clark Field in the Philippines. He escorted 54 G4M bombers as the Zeros roared in, catching the Americans flat-footed despite 9 hours of warning. After Pearl Harbor, Sakai shot down a P-40 Warhawk watching it break apart under his guns. Below, B-17s burned in neat rows. Sakai later said it looked like a forest fire. But what really hit him wasn't the easy victory, it was the sheer number of American planes destroyed. Over 100 wiped out in a single morning. If the Americans could afford to leave so many just sitting there, even after being warned, what kind of reserves did they have? Early 1942 seemed to prove that Japanese faith in quality over quantity was working. On February 3rd, flying from the newly taken base at Rabaul, Sakai fought over Bougainville, showing off the Zero's turning power against American wildcats that just couldn't keep up. In those days, the kill ratios seemed to back up everything the Japanese pilots believed. At the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th, Sakai's squadron tore through Allied aircraft, losing just a few Zeros in the process. Same story over Port Darwin. On February 19th, the Tainan Kokutai racked up a string of victories with barely any losses. Japanese pilots, some barely out of flight school, were downing enemy planes left and right. But if you looked past the headlines, some unsettling patterns started to show. Sakai noticed it early in 1942 after shooting down a B-17. The thing just wouldn't go down. He watched as the bomber soaked up hit after hit, its gunners coolly firing back even as flames ripped through the fuselage. That kind of tenacity shook him. And then there was the matter of replacements. When the Allies lost a plane, a new one showed up in days. When the Japanese lost a fighter, it took weeks, sometimes longer, to get a replacement from Japan. The math was brutal, and everyone seemed to ignore it. The Allies could replace losses faster than Japan could shoot them down. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, the Tainan Kokutai's operations officer, quietly did the numbers. At the current pace, Japan would need to shoot down 10 enemy planes for everyone they lost just to break even by 1944. In reality, they barely managed 3 to 1. August 7th, 1942, just after 5 in the morning, the scramble alarm blared at Rabaul's Lakunai airfield, and American forces had landed on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Catching the Japanese flat-footed, Sakai buckled into his Zero, one of 18 fighters tasked with escorting 27 G-4M bombers on a 560 nautical mile run to Guadalcanal, the longest fighter mission anyone had ever tried back then. The flight pushed everyone to their physical limits. For 4 hours, Sakai held formation over the Solomon Sea, nursing every drop of fuel, any wasted throttle, any unnecessary move, and that was it. You'd ditch in shark-infested waters on the way back. Behind Sakai, rookies struggled to keep up. Their fuel gauges dipped fast. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the fighters reached Guadalcanal and stared down an invasion fleet that just didn't seem real. The ocean was packed with warships. Later, Sakai wrote in his autobiography, Samurai, that he counted more than 70 ships, spotting what he thought were 6 carriers. In reality, there were 82 Allied ships, including 3 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, launching wave after wave of fighters. The battle that followed became the stuff of legend. Sakai shot down a dauntless dive bomber, then found himself locked in a wild dogfight with Lieutenant James Pug Sutherland, a Wildcat pilot from VF-5 off the Saratoga. The two of them twisted through the sky for almost 20 minutes, each wringing every last bit of performance out of their planes. Sutherland, here a veteran with over 500 combat hours, matched Sakai move for move until he finally ran out of ammo and peeled away. But the day's turning point came at 2:50 p.m. Sakai spotted what looked like 8 Wildcats flying loose below him at 8,000 feet. He dove in from their blind spot, closing to 50 meters before he realized, too late, that they weren't fighters. They were SBD Dauntless dive bombers, each with a rear gunner. Harold Lew Jones, the gunner in Lieutenant Dudley Adams's Dauntless from VS-5, opened up with his twin .30 caliber Brownings just as Sakai saw his mistake. Bullets ripped through the cockpit. One shot punched through Sakai's skull above his right eye, taking the eye instantly. Another round grazed his head, leaving him partly paralyzed on his left side. Blood poured into his remaining eye, blinding him. What happened next is one of the wildest feats in aviation history. Half conscious, paralyzed, and nearly blind, Sakai flew 560 nautical miles back to Rabaul, using nothing but volcanic smoke plumes to find his way. For nearly 5 hours, he drifted in and out of consciousness, at times almost flipping his plane into the ocean. He landed at Rabaul at 6 p.m. with less than 10 liters of fuel left in the tank. The numbers told the real story. Japan lost 23 aircraft and their crews in that fight. The Americans lost fewer planes and managed to rescue most of their downed pilots. While Japan scrambled to replace 24 lost aircraft, American carriers were already getting new planes fresh from the West Coast. As Sakai spent 8 months in the hospital recovering, the air war over Guadalcanal chewed through Japan's naval air force like a machine. The statistics from those months spelled it out. Japan simply couldn't keep up. The math was merciless, and it was only going to get worse. Between August 1942 and February 1943, the Japanese Navy lost almost 900 aircraft in the Solomons. Every one of those planes had a pilot behind the stick, guys with at least 500 hours in the air, and a lot with over 1,000. Japan had poured years of training into these men. They just couldn't make more fast enough. Pilot schools only turned out about 100 new pilots each month, and even that number came with less and less training, down to 400 hours by early 1943. The Americans, a whole different story. Pensacola alone cranked out 2,500 naval aviators every month, and there were thousands more coming from Corpus Christi, Jacksonville, and San Diego. Each American rookie got at least 400 hours in the air, including 100 hours in the real combat aircraft they'd be flying. When fresh pilots hit the front, veteran squadron mates took them under their wing, guiding them through those first dangerous missions. Commander Minoru Genda, who'd helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, went to Guadalcanal in October 1942 and was shocked by what he saw. In a report marked Top Secret for Admiral Yamamoto, he wrote, "We are literally wearing away our naval aviation strength in a war of attrition. We cannot win. The enemy replaces losses immediately. We cannot replace them at all." Japan tried to fight smarter. They pushed operations out from Rabaul with new forward bases, launched huge fighter sweeps, and kept experimenting with fresh tactics. But none of it really worked against the flood of American planes and pilots. The production gap was just too big. Back in 1940, before America even joined the war, the U.S. turned out 12,804 military aircraft. Japan, already 3 years deep in the war with China, managed just 4,768, and that was flat-out maximum effort. America was still in peacetime mode. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and American industry kicked into high gear overnight. Ford's Willow Run, plant in Michigan, built from scratch during the war, was making one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes by 1944. That factory alone was bigger than all of Japan's aircraft plants put together. At its peak, 42,000 workers put together bombers from a mind-boggling 1.5 million parts. North American aviation built over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, faster, tougher, and deadlier than the Zero. Grumman rolled out 12,275 F-6F Hellcats in just 2.5 years. The Hellcat was designed specifically to beat the Zero, and it did. shooting down more Japanese planes than anything else, rolling off the line at over a dozen a day. It wasn't just numbers. The Americans kept pushing out new, better planes every quarter. Japan tried to keep the aging Zero in the fight, but it was falling behind. The F-4U Corsair could outrun the Zero by 80 mph. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and heavy guns, could hit from heights where the Zero's engine just gave up. By mid-1943, American engines were cranking out 2,000 horsepower. The Zeros managed just 130. American fighters had armor. The Zero? None. High-octane fuel gave U.S. planes even more punch, while Japanese pilots had to make do with weaker gas. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces, came back to limited duty in June 1943, blind in one eye, depth perception shot. They sent him to Toyohashi Air Base to train new pilots, and what he saw was grim. The kids coming in from primary training had barely 150 hours in the cockpit. That's less than what American pilots got before they ever saw a combat plane. We were supposed to make fighter pilots out of these children in 3 months, Sakai said years later. They could barely land without crashing. We were sending them to die, nothing more. Even the planes they trained in were falling apart. Old machines from the China War, patched over and over until they barely flew. Fuel was so tight each student got only 60 hours of flying during advanced training. No spare parts. If a plane broke, they stripped it for parts just to keep the others running. The instructors? Mostly wounded vets like Sakai, men who should have been out of the war, but Japan couldn't spare them. They tried to teach these teenagers everything they knew, but most wouldn't live long enough to use it. The numbers tell the story. By late 1943, most new pilots died within 6 months of reaching the front. Sakai, injuries and all, volunteered to fight again in June 1944. The American push into the Marianas meant B-29 bombers were about to threaten Japan itself, so every pilot, blind, wounded, whoever, was sent to the line. They put Sakai with Yokosuka Kokutai and shipped him out to Iwo Jima on June 24, 1944. Sakai showed up right in the middle of what Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On just one day, June 19th, Japanese naval aviation lost 315 planes and 445 aircrew. The Americans? They lost 29 planes and got most of their pilots back. 5 days later, June 24th, Sakai flew his first combat mission from Iwo Jima. He got a taste of the new reality fast. He led a section of 4 Zeros up to intercept what he thought would be manageable formations, like back in 1942. Instead, he ran into a wall of over 200 American aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, Dauntlesses. They came in perfect waves, stacked up, fighters on top, bombers in the middle, torpedo planes down low. The sky was black with them, he told historian Henry Sakida in 1994. For every plane they engaged, 5 more showed up. During the fight, Sakai ended up alone against 15 F-6F Hellcats. He threw everything he had at them, ducking into clouds, snap-rolling his Zero so hard it nearly tore apart, even diving so close to the ocean that seawater splashed over his canopy. He claimed he damaged a Hellcat, but he knew it didn't matter. The Americans could lose dozens and barely feel it. The numbers were brutal. Japan sent 450 aircraft into the Marianas fight and lost 480 in just 3 days. Counting reinforcements, Task Force 58 launched nearly 1,000 sorties on June 19th alone. They lost 29 planes and wiped out 2/3 of Japanese naval aviation in a single afternoon. By October 1944, when Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi set up the kamikaze units at Mabalacat in the Philippines, it wasn't about fanaticism. It was necessity, math, plain and simple. Sakai saw it clearly. In a 1998 interview, he said, "You must understand, we had boys with 30 hours of flight time going up against Americans with 300 hours. They couldn't even find the enemy, much less shoot them down. If they flew normally, they died, achieving nothing. If they flew kamikaze, they might at least damage a ship." The training system had collapsed. The Ukraine, the Naval Aviator Preparatory Course, was cranking out students in 90 days with under 100 hours of flight time. Many had never fired their guns in flight. Ammo was too scarce for practice. They couldn't navigate beyond sight of land. Forget dogfighting. Meanwhile, the Americans just kept coming. Task Force 38 could launch 1 to 200 aircraft from 17 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, swapping out squadrons as fast as they took losses. If an air group got battered, it went home and a fresh one showed up. Japanese units fought until nobody was left. Sakai's last combat missions were during the defense of Japan itself. In 1945, basing out of Yokosuka, near Tokyo, he flew up to intercept B-29 raids and later carrier strikes. What he saw was almost beyond words. During Operation Tengo, the defense of Okinawa in April 1945, Japan threw massive kamikaze attacks at the American fleet, but by then the Americans had defense down to an art. Radar picked up incoming raids, 5-inch guns opened up at 10,000 yards, 40 guns at 4,000, 20 meters at 2,000. Proximity-fused shells exploded right next to the planes. Combat air patrols, sometimes 50 Hellcats or more, orbited at different heights, ready to jump incoming attackers 50 miles out. Sakai remembered, "We would start with 100 aircraft. By the time we reached the American fleet, maybe 20 were left. Of those, maybe 1 or 2 actually hit a ship, usually a destroyer on radar picket duty. The Americans had so many ships that losing a destroyer meant nothing to them. The numbers from Okinawa are staggering. Japan launched 1,465 kamikaze sorties and lost over 1,000 planes in regular attacks. They sank 36 American ships and damaged 368, but Task Force 58 kept running, launching 40,000 combat sorties. For every American ship sunk, Japan lost 60 planes and pilots. Sakai's last combat flight came in early August 1945, days before Japan surrendered. He led a flight of Zeros from Yokosuka, ordered to intercept B-32 Dominators, photographing the ruins of Tokyo. It summed up the whole war. Obsolete fighters chasing the newest American bomber, which was just a backup because the US could afford to have spares of everything. The Zeros couldn't catch them. All Sakai could do was watch as they photographed what was left of Japanese cities. The war was already lost. These missions just recorded the destruction. You look at the production numbers and it's all there. That's the story of Japan's defeat in the air. The United States cranked out a staggering 295 959 aircraft during World War II. 465 of those were fighters. Japan built 76,320 planes with 30,447 fighters. To put it in perspective, in 1944 alone, American factories rolled out 96 to 218 planes, more than Japan managed over the entire war. Just the number of U.S. fighters outpaced all types of Japanese aircraft combined, but numbers only tell part of the story. American planes in 1945 were nothing like what they'd flown in 1941. Take the P-51D Mustang. It could hit 437 km/h, while the Japanese Zero struggled to top 331 mph. The F-4U-4 Corsair climbed at 4,500 feet per minute. The Zero managed 3,100. Japanese designs barely changed. The A6M50 that ace pilot Saburo Sakai flew in 1944 was almost the same as the A6M2 from 3 years earlier, maybe a little faster, but it still had no armor, the same guns, and that weak engine. And it's not just about the planes. Behind every cockpit, you had a pilot. And America just overwhelmed Japan with sheer numbers. The US trained 193,440 pilots, including nearly 61,000 naval aviators. Japan trained about 15,000 naval and 25,000 army pilots. American training stayed strong over 400 flight hours before combat. Japanese pilot training just fell apart. In 1941, they got 700 to 800 hours. By 1945, some only had 50 to 100 hours before being thrown into battle. By the end, American rookies often had more flight time than Japanese instructors. Japanese pilots themselves saw what was happening. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's top ace, told Sakai during his last leave in October 1944, "It's not like before, Saburo. In 1942, I could attack a whole squadron by myself. Now they come in swarms, 50, 100, 200 at a time. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We're just swallowed up." Nishizawa died later that month, not in a dogfight, but as a passenger. His transport was shot down by American Hellcats, the greatest Japanese ace, dead and unable even to fight back. That's what the war looked like in the end. Commander Masatake Okumiya broke it down in his book Zero. He wrote, "We thought spirit could beat material disadvantage. We believed one Japanese pilot was worth 3 Americans. Maybe that was true in 1941. By 1943, the Americans had better planes. By 1944, they had better pilots. By 1945, there were just so many. Individual skill didn't matter anymore." Tetsuzo Iwamoto, one of the few top Japanese aces to survive, put it simply, "I shot down a Hellcat in the morning. That afternoon, 3 more showed up. I shot one down. Next morning, there were 10. How do you fight that? You don't. You just try to survive. But sometimes the numbers fade, and you see the people." On February 9th, 1942, Sakai was strafing an airfield in Java. He dove on what he thought was a military transport. As he got closer, he saw women and children through the windows. Dutch civilians fleeing the chaos. "I couldn't fire," Sakai said. They weren't soldiers. They were mothers and children running from war. He pulled up, waggled his wings to signal them to leave. The Dutch pilot waved back. Sakai's wingmen held their fire too. The transport made it to Australia. Those people survived because one pilot, in the middle of a war, chose to see them as human beings, not targets. 40 years later, at a reunion in the US, a Dutch woman approached Sakai, tears in her eyes. She'd been a child on that plane. Her life, her family's lives, all traced back to that one moment of mercy. In his later years, Sakai cut through the myths about Japanese pilots and the kamikaze. He spoke at American military and aviation museums, tearing down the old stories about dying for the emperor. You want to know what kamikaze pilots thought about as they dove at your ships? He asked a Naval Academy crowd in 1991. Not the emperor, not honor. They thought about their mothers. They cried for their mothers. I heard their last words, "Okasan, Okasan, mother, mother." They were boys scared out of their minds, not fanatics. Sakai didn't pretend the Bushido code was real either. Bushido was just propaganda. To make us willing to die, he said. The old samurai fought when they had the advantage and ran when they didn't. They weren't stupid. We were. We tried to beat math itself and then wondered why we lost. His most controversial words came when he appeared alongside Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay. If Japan had built the atomic bomb first and they told me to drop it on Los Angeles, I wouldn't have hesitated. That's just how war works. America was simply better at it than we were. In a 1998 interview, Sakai didn't hide his anger at Japan's leaders. People always ask why we kept fighting when we knew we couldn't win. The truth is, the ordinary pilots, the young guys dying in their planes, believed the propaganda. They thought we were winning right up until the end. Only the top officers knew the real situation, but they chose death over the shame of surrender. The militarists who started the war, they knew how strong America was. They'd been there. They saw the factories, the resources, the technology. Still, they convinced themselves that Japanese spirit could beat all that. So they sent us off to die for their fantasy. When it came to his own combat record, Sakai was upfront about the difference between his official numbers and what got published. At one point, Americans thought he had 64 aerial victories, a number his ghostwriter just made up. Sakai set the record straight. The official count was 28, including shared kills. In war, everyone exaggerates. The numbers don't really matter. What matters is that we live to talk honestly about what war actually is. After the war, something unexpected happened. Former enemies found ways to connect. In May 1982, historian Henry Sakaider arranged for Sakai to meet Harold Lew Jones, the gunner who'd shot out Sakai's eye and nearly killed him at Guadalcanal. They met at the Nimitz Museum. It could have been tense or awkward, but it wasn't. Sakai brought his old flying helmet, still torn and blood-stained from the day Jones hit him. Jones held it, hands shaking, suddenly realizing the real human cost of that moment. "I was just doing my job," Jones said, almost whispering. "I never thought about the man in the plane." Sakai told him, "You were doing your duty. So was I. We were young, serving our countries. No hatred, just respect." The two men became friends and wrote to each other often, right up until Jones died. In 2009, Sakai even gave Jones the helmet, saying it belonged with the man whose skill had ended his own flying days. Sakai tried to explain to Japanese audiences that America didn't win because of courage or skill. Both sides had plenty of that. America won because of organization, production, and training. The American pilot training program was a machine. By 1943, the U.S. Navy had a system that pumped out pilots with at least 400 hours in the air. By the end, Japan was sending up rookies with barely 100 hours. When Sakai said American planes came by the dozens, he wasn't exaggerating. During the big operations, U.S. aircraft carriers could launch wave after wave. Look at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Japan sent up 373 planes in 4 waves. The Americans put up 956 sorties from 15 carriers. End result, Japan lost 315 planes. America lost 29. That's what military theorists call numerical overmatch. So many opponents that skill doesn't matter. When you're facing 5, 10, even 15 enemy planes, it's just math. In his later years, Sakai worked hard to build friendships with former enemies. He even sent his daughter to study in America. Learn English, learn democracy, learn why they won, he told her. She ended up marrying an American Army officer, which felt like closing a circle. At air shows and reunions, Sakai would sign autographs with American aces, swapping stories about old dogfights. Guys who once tried to kill each other would laugh together like old friends. Sakai's message to young Japanese never changed. We lost because we believed our own propaganda. We thought spirit could beat reality. America won because they did the math. How many planes, how many pilots, how much fuel. They counted. We dreamed. To Americans, Sakai offered a different lesson. You won because you could outproduce us, but that production came from freedom. Free workers in free factories built more than any regimented system could. America's strength wasn't just the numbers, but the system behind them. In the end, the numbers tell the story. During the war, the US built 28 fleet carriers and 71 escort carriers. Japan managed 6 fleet carriers and 4 escorts. The math was impossible from the start. Look at the numbers. There's just no escaping them. The United States trained 60,956 naval aviators. Japan managed about 15,000. In 1944, America churned out 6.5 billion gallons of aviation fuel. Japan only 315 million. The pattern was always the same. America could afford to lose 10 planes for every Japanese one and still keep fighting just through sheer volume. But the reality was even starker. They shot down multiple Japanese aircraft for every American loss. The outcome was set. Fast forward to September 22nd, 2000, Saburo Sakai was 84, still alert and dignified, sitting at a formal dinner at the Atsugi Naval Air Station Officers Club. The U.S. Navy had invited him as an honored guest. He sat among American naval officers swapping stories about dogfights and talking about what came after the war. At one point, he said, "I spent my youth trying to kill Americans. I've spent my old age befriending them. The second task has been more rewarding than the first." As the night wound down, a young American aviator, Lieutenant Commander William Johnson, stood up to thank Sakai. Sakai stood too, reached across the table, and suddenly went rigid. He managed to finish the handshake, then collapsed. In the ambulance, racing to the hospital, he died. His last conscious act was reaching out to an American in a friendship. Nobody missed the meaning. The legendary Japanese ace who once tried so hard to kill Americans died shaking hands with one in peace. Sakai once said, "American planes came by dozens, even though Japanese pilots shot them down week after week." That gets to the heart of industrial war. Individual heroism, strategy, and spirit don't matter much when you're buried under mountains of resources, all organized and ready to go. The stats lay it out. America built nearly 4 times more aircraft, trained nearly 5 times more pilots, made 20 times more aviation fuel, and built almost 10 times more aircraft carriers than Japan. And they still managed to shoot down more enemy planes than they lost. But Sakai understood why those numbers played out that way. In his last interview 3 months before he died, he said, "America won because it was a free society that went all in on the war. Free workers built planes faster than forced laborers in our factories. Free scientists came up with better tech than our regimented researchers. Free pilots fought with more creativity than our indoctrinated ones. Those dozens of replacement planes weren't just metal, they were the product of freedom itself." He paused. "We thought we were fighting for our emperor god. They knew they were fighting for their way of life. That's why they could produce all those planes, train all those pilots, keep flying all those missions. They were defending something worth defending." The real lesson from Sakai isn't just about numbers, it's about what creates those numbers in the first place. Japan's military leaders believed that a few exceptional warriors could beat many average enemies. America believed in mass production, overwhelming force, and learning from mistakes. The samurai ran into the assembly line, and the assembly line won. Not because Americans were braver or more skilled. Sakai proved Japanese pilots could match anyone, but the assembly line could replace what it lost, adapt faster, and learn quicker than the old ways. When Sakai said, "We shot them down every week, but they came by dozens," he was talking about more than just dogfights. He was witnessing the end of the warrior class and the rise of industrial warfare, where victory goes not to the best, but to the side with more. Japan never stood a real chance. Sakai, fighter, survivor, peacemaker, became living proof of that shift. His journey, from shooting down American planes to shaking hands with American pilots, mirrors Japan's transformation from empire to democracy, from warrior nation to global economic force, from shut off and militant to open and allied. The waves of American planes that once overwhelmed him became the foundation for peace. That final handshake at Atsugi finished as his life ended, sealed a reconciliation written across the skies of the Pacific by young men who gave everything they had, only to discover that, against the cold math of American industry, everything just wasn't enough. The dozens always came, and in the end, the dozens always won.